Not sure, but I'm happy to go. My name is Dr. Tania Reynolds, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Kinsey Institute and Department of Gender Studies at Indiana University. I was trained as a social psychologist, and during my graduate program, I took a seminar course with my advisor, Roy Baumeister, where we went over men, masculinity, and I was introduced to a lot of the patterns on men's outcomes. And so we even met Christina Hoff Summer. She came to our class, and so that class really sparked my interest in these patterns. And when we looked at the empirical literature, I mean, there were a lot of papers looking at documenting negative perceptions of women and stereotypes holding women back, but none really looking at the reverse pattern. So when might stereotypes hold men back, or what biases might work against men's interests? And so we conducted some studies looking at either their biases and their concerns for men compared to women.
And I got there from doing years and years of working with men and women. Of course, I started off working with men because the other therapists didn't want to work with the men. You know, it was all female therapists, and they said, no, it was a grief counseling group. And they said, no, we don't want to work with men. You do it, Colin. So I did it, and I got thrust into this place of working with a lot of men. And so it got me interested in how men and women are different. And one of the things I noticed right off the bat was that a woman's pain is a call to action, and a man's pain is taboo. And I have to sit here and thank Tania Reynolds for putting some numbers and some research into that statement, because really what she's saying is, yep, Golan, that's true. You know, and now we have the research to back it up, that there is this bias against men. And that's kind of where I started out. And it's, I've been, you know, my YouTube channel is one of the things that I love, along with menargood.com. And we'll see where we go from there. So I'm in.
Yeah, I'm Janice Fiamengo. I'm a retired professor of English from the University of Ottawa. And for about the last 5 years, I've been making a video series called The Fiamengo File. It's mainly about academic feminism and the way that, you know, all of the academic feminist theories, many of them really, you know, quite bizarre and unsupported either by common sense or by any real research, have not only spread throughout the academy, but from there, you know, into all sorts of fields of social work and policing and journalism and the law of the family courts in particular, into sexual assault trials, you know, and just into the general culture, so that we're actually willing to accept bizarre ideas about toxic masculinity and male privilege, and the fact that all men benefit from a culture of female violence against women, you know, and so on and so on. And one of the first videos I did was called The Empathy Gap. And it's one of the things that continues to astound me and sadden me, and sometimes leads me to the brink of despair, the way in which so few people in our culture seem interested in the many problems and issues that disproportionately affect men, and how, you know, whenever a woman makes a claim or an angry accusation, we're all, you know, in general willing to jump to and ask, what can we do to solve it? And if a man does the same, people turn away. And so yeah, I'm really interested in Tania's work and thankful to her. I should mention, I can't stay here very long. It is Super Bowl Sunday and we're going over to my mom's place. So I'm not sure how long I can stay, but I definitely wanted to register my interest and my gratitude to you, Tania, for doing this work. It's incredibly important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you guys.
Thank you, Troy. Yes, I'm Mike Buchanan, leader of the British political party I launched 7 years ago, Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them. We remain the only political party in the English-speaking world campaigning for the human rights of men and boys, which resulted in so many areas by states' actions and inactions, almost always to privilege women and girls. We're also the only anti-feminist political party in the English-speaking world, something of which I'm very proud. I greatly enjoyed Tania Reynolds' interview on the Heterodox Academy website, Men as Stereotypical Perpetrators of Harm, and listened to it again today. At one point, she referred to a study in which people were more inclined to donate money to women's homeless shelters than men's homeless shelters. And I was reminded of Erin Pitsey, the woman who set up the first refuge for battered women and children in London in the early 1970s. She soon realized that most of the women were violent too and tried to establish a refuge for battered men. But the rich men who had funded the women's refuge refused to donate so much as £1 towards a men's refuge. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion tonight, exploring the moral bias against men. The culture is becoming more compassionate towards men and boys. I think we have indicators of that all the time. And in time, that will be reflected in a change in politics.
Can I jump in? I think you may have been talking about me. This is Robert Franklin.
Oh, Robert.
I do. My phone was on mute, and I couldn't unmute it. Anyway. Sure. Let's see. I'm Robert Franklin. I'm on the board of the National Parents Organization. I'm an attorney in Texas, and I have been reading, researching, and writing about issues particularly pertaining to fathers and fathers' rights in family courts, adoption courts, etc., for, since 1998, about 22 years. And Tom Golan was kind enough to alert me a video where she introduced her 4 studies demonstrating scientifically the lack of interest in empathy for males. And obviously, when you spend as much time as I have writing about fathers in family courts, the extent to which men are given the back seat in this society, it can't escape you for long, because that, of course, is front and center in family courts. So I was very pleased to listen to Dr. Reynolds and look forward to hearing more.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So this all started with a seminar class hosted by Dr. Roy Baumeister, where we learned about some of these issues afflicting men, and this project spurred from that with my colleague Hal there, and then a lot of my colleagues joined in, and we compiled a lot of data. So we actually have 3 separate projects, but I'll talk more about the one that is furthest along in the review process, because I think that gets to the root of the pattern, whereas the subsequent packages look more at the societal implications, which are huge and important, but your guys, a lot of your work can attest to that more strongly. So in this first package, it's under review, getting close to being published. It's called Man Up and Take It. There's a gender bias and moral typecasting. And so what we did is we looked at, so Kurt Gray, who's a moral psychologist, he argues that when we see moral actions, we kind of instinctively typecast the individuals as the harm-inflicting perpetrator or the suffering patient or victim. And so he finds that these roles are somewhat mutually exclusive, such that the more you see someone as a perpetrator, it's harder for you to see them as a victim. And the more that you see someone as a victim, it's harder for you to see them as a perpetrator. But our responses to those cast in each role are very different. So in response to perpetrators, we blame them, want to punish them. And then in response to victims, we feel sympathy and we want to aid them. So we wanted to examine, okay, is there a bias in this tendency to moral typecast such that men are more likely to be placed in the perpetrator role and women in the victim role? And so we conducted a series of 6 studies with over 3,000 participants. And in the first one, we showed that, so if you give people these scenarios where someone is harmed, these were 3 ones that were in the workplace, and we left it ambiguous of who harmed who. People were more likely to assume the victim or the harmed target was female, suggesting we have this implicit association with like harm and women. But then we also manipulated the labeling of the targets. So we either called them victim and perpetrator, kind of activating this moral cognitive approach, versus just labeling them neutrally as party A and party B. And when we found that when you label the targets as victim and perpetrator and activate this moral lens, people were even more likely to assume the victim was female. Thank you guys.
Thank you, Troy.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So this all started with a seminar class hosted by Dr. Roy Baumeister, where we learned about some of these issues afflicting men, and this project spurred from that with my colleague Hal there. And then, a lot of my colleagues joined in, and we compiled a lot of data. So we actually have 3 separate projects, but I'll talk more about the one that is furthest along in the review process, because I think that gets to the root of the pattern, whereas the subsequent packages look more at the societal implications, which are huge and important, but your guys, a lot of your work can attest to that more strongly. So in this first package, it's under review, getting close to being published. It's called Man Up and Take It. It's a gender bias and moral typecasting. And so what we did is we looked at, so Kurt Gray, who's a moral psychologist, he argues that when we see moral actions, we kind of instinctively typecast the individuals as the harm-inflicting perpetrator or the suffering patient or victim. And so he finds that these roles are somewhat mutually exclusive, such that the more you see someone as a perpetrator, it's harder for you to see them as a victim. And the more that you see someone as a victim, it's harder for you to see them as a perpetrator. But our responses to those cast in each role are very different. So in response to perpetrators, we blame them, want to punish them. And then in response to victims, we feel sympathy and we want to aid them. So we wanted to examine, okay, is there a bias in this tendency to moral typecast such that men are more likely to be placed in the perpetrator role and women in the victim role? And so we conducted a series of 6 studies with over 3,000 participants. And in the first one, we showed that so if you give people these scenarios where someone is harmed, these were 3 ones that were in the workplace, and we left it ambiguous of who harmed who, people were more likely to assume the victim or the harmed target was female, suggesting we have this implicit association with like harm and women. But then we also manipulated the labeling of the targets. So we either called them victim and perpetrator, kind of activating this moral cognitive approach, versus just labeling them neutrally as party A and party B. And when we found that when you label the targets as victim and perpetrator and activate this moral lens, people were even more likely to assume the victim was female, suggesting that in these moral domains, we have an especially strong link between harm, the person being harmed is female. And so then we were like, okay, well, maybe it's just based off of the particular scenarios we used, because these were in the workplace. And typically it was like someone in a superior role harming someone in a subordinate role, which people might have like these gender stereotypes going into it, that perhaps men are in positions of power. So this next study, we looked at triangles that were they appeared to kind of poke one another. So each participant viewed a series of 3 videos where the triangles were kind of almost attacking one another. But we told the participants, now the harm isn't physical harm; it's non-physical, and these 2 triangles represent a male and female coworker. And we had them rate, how much do you think, the orange triangle is a perpetrator? How much is the orange triangle a victim? How much is the green triangle a perpetrator? How much is the green triangle a victim? And then we asked them, is the orange triangle male or female? And is the green triangle male or female? And we found that the more participants saw a triangle as a perpetrator, the more likely they were to label that triangle as male, and the more likely they saw a triangle as a victim, the more likely they were to label that triangle as female. So what was important about this study is that it removed a lot of the human attributes, suggesting that this bias is happening at a pretty low level. But we also found this bias in more social scenarios. So in other studies, we looked at how do you feel when a group of female employees are laid off compared to male employees. And people were more likely to assume that the female employees suffered more pain and that the managers had intended to inflict harm on them. And they saw the managers who fired them as less moral, which is, and we chose this scenario in particular. So we found this pattern, even though it was a scenario in which men tend to show worse outcomes. So in the context of job loss, as I'm sure you guys know, men tend to show worse outcomes. And a lot of our stereotypes suggest men should be the breadwinners. And so what you would think is in this context where, if anything, base rates of harm and stereotypes would be suggesting that men should be seen as victims, even in these contexts, it was still harder to identify men suffering and feel the same level of outrage when men had suffered the same harm. And so then we got some pushback from the reviewers. Well, like, what if it's just the case that this is about gender discrimination? Because the scenario we used was manufacturing. So they thought, well, maybe they're just thinking that when women are being fired, it's due to gender discrimination. So we said, okay, we'll choose scenarios, workplaces where tend to be more male dominated and workplaces that tend to be more female dominated. And we found that when women were fired from situations where it could be attributable to gender discrimination, this plausibility of discrimination kind of amplified the link between women and victimhood. So people were even more likely to see women as victims, whereas when men's firing could be due to discrimination, you didn't see an amplifying where men were more likely to be seen as victims. And people also assumed that the managers intended to inflict harm on the women. So even in these contexts where men would be experiencing harmful outcomes, we still see this pattern where we more strongly identify, we can more easily recognize women's suffering, and there's a stronger cognitive link between women and victimhood, making it just easier for us to recognize when women are suffering than when men are. And when we looked at, another study where we looked at, an ambiguous joke in the workplace, we found that the bias cut both ways. So not only were people more likely to be sympathetic to women who had heard this joke, so the victims, they were also more likely to desire to punish men who had made the same exact joke and less likely to support them being nominated for a managerial position. So suggesting that not only is it difficult for us to recognize men's suffering and place them in the victim role, it's also more challenging for us to recognize women's perpetration and place women in the perpetrator role. So it cuts both ways. And I think this pattern makes a lot of sense if we think about gender stereotypes that we've done a lot of research on. And so people have argued that we see women as more communal and having these traits associated with benevolence, being kind and warm and gentle. And that harms them in contexts where you need to be assertive, so in like negotiations or in leadership roles, it's harder for us to see women in these leadership or agentic roles because we see them as more like nurturing and warm. And whereas we see men as more agentic and assertive and agents of change, which helps them in these leadership contexts. But then when we take the context of harm and apply that, what that means is for men, it's easier to place them in the perpetrator role, the more agentic role. And for women, it's harder to place them in the perpetrator role, easier to place them in the victim role where we feel warm feelings towards them, sympathy. So I think this pattern of bias is totally consistent with the claims, the valid claims that feminists have been making about these stereotypes holding women back in the workplace. But we just have yet to acknowledge that these biases also manifest in these other contexts where it's much easier to see men as the agentic role and see them as perpetrators, and then inflict punishment. And it's a lot harder for us to see them as suffering victims and identify with their suffering when it is there. In a lot of cases, it is there, as you guys know. So that's the general takeaway from that package of findings. And then in subsequent findings, we've looked at some of the implications. And we found, for example, that when people read a script where a politician is talking about men's issues versus a politician talking about women's issues, even though the statements are only true when they're applying to men, people are more likely to believe the politician is moral for talking about the women's issues, even though they're not true. They're more likely to want to donate to the politician's campaigns and vote for the politician talking about women's issues, even though it's based on true discrepancies where men have worse outcomes. So, and the participants realized, or at least the male participants did in that study, that in fact the statements about men were true, but yet we still found this pattern where people showed more support for a politician talking about women's issues. So this cognitive bias, this reluctance to see men as victims, has other implications that our future work is trying to lay out and show that, like, even when you present these patterns, we still can't muster the same concern and sympathy.
Well, my name is Harry Crouch. I'm president of the National Coalition for Men, which is the oldest men's rights organization in the world. I'm actually from Alaska, but in this context, I'm sitting in Southern California without my parka or winter boots. I'm quite happy about that. And what brought me here, you dragged my ass into this thing. So now that I finally figured out how to log in, I'm here. What else would you like to know, Troy? Excuse me? Oh, the Duluth model, one of my favorites. Tania?
Yeah.
Did you pronounce it correctly?
Yes.
Now, congratulations on your study. We've been fighting all that stuff for years. Very well aware of everything. It's nice to have an academic put a stamp on it.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice, actually. Particularly the political aspect. It drives you nuts. The Duluth model fits right into that. I'm not sure where the mentally handicapped people came up with the Duluth model, but it's my understanding it was a woman with a BA degree in sociology. I don't want to be too critical because I have a BA in sociology. But at least it's from the University of Alaska, Anchorage, which is further north from, my brain's a little bit more chilled. The Duluth model set in progress some very serious things with respect to our society and our culture. And it's not changed. Everybody in this call is familiar with the Duluth model. So it's not outrageous to say that it has caused incredible damage to untold numbers of people. A lot of people, when they look at the perpetrators and victims, and they look at domestic violence, they think the perpetrator deserves everything they get. Perhaps that's true. But that also extends to their family, their parents, their children, their brothers, their sisters, their friends, anybody else who's been involved in their defense or their life. So everybody has been adversely impacted by the domestic violence industry and the Duluth model, which requires one to admit guilt even if they're not guilty. And then you get access to have your name on a list that goes on forever and ever, so the police can look you up. The consequences follow one after another after another. And that's politics. Now it's politics. Now it's exhibited in the Violence Against Women Act and other federal legislation. But that's enough said. Everybody on this call knows about the Duluth model. And I suspect anybody listening or going to listen has the ability to look it up on the internet.
Yeah, I thought it was a really great film because it showed I loved watching her struggle with it and like conflicting, dealing with the conflictions of this, and like encountering these data and the patterns. And I thought she did a great job of presenting it in a compassionate light. And it is. This is an issue about compassion. You know, it's very easy to think of examples of men who are bad, but that's overlooking so many contexts where men are good or men are victims, you know, and we have this, as Janice notes, this gap in empathy, you know, where we don't recognize as easily the suffering of men. And if you look at, I mean, at least in the context of like intimate partner violence, the rates are pretty similar among the perpetration of both perpetrators are both men and women. The rates are pretty comparable, and so we have this stereotype that that intimate partner violence is male on female violence when the data don't support that. And so, and even when there are discrepancies in line with our assumption of the male perpetrator and female victim, so there are discrepancies in rates of sexual violence, but still, even if you look at, for example, those who report rape, according to the CDC, it's 21% of women and 7% of men. And you can say, okay, well, there's a disparity here, but that's still 7% of men is still 8 million men. So to look at these issues of violence in a gender lens does a disservice to the men who are also affected. If you care about violence, then why is it only concern when the victim matches our prototype of what a victim looks like?
Troy, may I make a comment?
Of course.
I want to get this in before I don't have an opportunity. There's a new book out. It's called The Judicial War on Men by Dr. Eric Nelson. Been working on it for a couple of years. Some of you have seen it. I know Janice is shaking her head. Perhaps she's seen it. But to Tania's point, he finds this is fascinating, that the California Judicial Council has buried statistical information with respect to domestic violence restraining orders being issued to men and women, and that that the Judicial Council, the head legal organization in California, knows that judges issue restraining orders to women, you ready for this? 620% more often than men. 620%. This goes to Tania's research about the politics, and about how men are viewed versus women, and sympathy versus non-sympathy. Here we have Supreme Court justices and their research so fearful of it that they buried it. And Dr. Nelson had to dig it up. He also found out through his research that 57% of DVRO allegations are false. That's another number in the mix of dice when it comes to false allegations. Also, I think, lending credibility to your research. Thank you.
How is it my fault?
I believe it.
What? Okay, fine. I'll cop the blame. I do want to say to Dr. Reynolds, thank you very, very much. I mean, like, Allison and I have been talking about the issue of sort of a gendered lens when it comes to moral agency and moral patiency. And that'd be Allison Tiemann and I. And also, you know, sort of this, I mean, even if you look at Cartman's drama triangle, where in an unhealthy relationship, two people will trade the roles. There's three basic roles: the essentially the hero, the villain, and the victim. And the two people embroiled in the unhealthy relationship will take turns being those things, right? But Allison and I sort of, you know, from probably way back in 2010, 2011, we were starting to really look into the idea that we more readily see men in the roles of hero and villain, the roles that employ agency, and women more readily in the roles. Allison put it this way one day, and it was just such a beautiful line that I had to steal it and use it over and over again. She said, "We view women as the substrate upon which men write their actions." And I was just like, oh shit, right? And so, I mean, like, because she's got an academic background, but oh my God, I'm going to kill whoever's phoning right now. But she's got an academic background, but it's in fine arts or in industrial arts and things like that. And I don't have any kind of academic background at all. So we've sort of, when we started discussing these things, we're sort of like, please let somebody with the academic chops actually do the work, right? To look at this kind of stuff and examine it. And you did that. And that is actually, we have a lot of gratitude to you for that. Yeah. So.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I want to say that I really appreciate all the work that you guys are doing. I feel like it's one thing to sit behind a computer and run a study. It's a whole other thing to be dealing with the impact of these biases and to be working with those afflicted by these biases. And that is a much harder task and a much more noble task. So I want to say that, like, I'm very grateful for all the work that you guys are doing.
Look at it the other way. I'm like, it's really easy to sit behind my computer and speculate on what's really going on here and just essentially say, well, and these are my conjectures, and I'll leave it to some academics to actually do the work that is involved in demonstrating whether they're factual, correct, or or whatever. And it's very easy for me to do that. I just have to say, well, hey, this thought came into my head, and I think it's right, but it doesn't have to be right because I don't have a reputation to lose. And then somebody has to come along like you and actually test the hypothesis, which is a lot of really boring work that I have no interest in doing. So there you go.
That's why specialization is good. But I didn't actually know about your hypothesis, but I really like that framework of the substrate, of like the recipient of men's actions, because it's tapping into the same concept. I don't think that these are new ideas. It's just we needed more data. I mean, you guys have talked about these things. We just needed additional data. But I think it's a perfect summary of it, And so there are going to be cases where that assumption about women are the substrate onto which they receive men's actions, that can harm women in a lot of ways. But in the context of these moral situations, it's going to be so much easier for us to see women as the victims of men's aggression. And you do find like the biases or like the patterns of the judicial rulings in the court systems that fit that exactly, where men tend to receive longer sentences and are more likely to be found guilty for the same exact crime if you hold crime severity constant. But you also find that when it is male on female violence, you see the widest discrepancy where men receive the harshest sentences. So when in the moral realm, when we see that confirming our prototype of gendered relations, then that activates our moral response even more strongly.
One, he's like, male privilege is myth, changed my mind. And the first person who sat down with him says something along the lines of, okay, so let's say you have a woman and she's gone to jail because she abused drugs while she was pregnant and that messed the kid up. And so she's gone to jail for child abuse. But the man who impregnated her, he gets off scot-free. And it's like, and I'm like, but the man who impregnated her is legally, I mean, what's he supposed to do? Kidnap her and strap her to a chair and feed her leafy greens and beta carotene and keep her from doing drugs? Because that's a felony. he does that. He has no say in whether she continues with the pregnancy or aborts it. He's, I mean, isn't it enough that I mean, he may have ejaculated somewhere in her vicinity and then left the state to go, I don't know, to school or to do fracking in Idaho or something, and 6 years later he can be tracked down and made to pay for this special needs kid that he didn't even know existed, because there's no law or even social norm requiring her to let him know that he has a kid, until the welfare system wants to be paid back for all the money they coughed up for this child. So like, isn't it enough that he's responsible for that kid? Like, no, he needs to go to jail too, because he impregnated a woman who decided she was going to gobble meth while she was pregnant with his baby, right? Like, I'm just like, this is male privilege. This is a video about male privilege, and this is the situation that that men sometimes find themselves in, and it's not enough. It's not enough that he has to pay for that woman's choices, unilateral choices about carrying that baby to term, while eating handfuls of pills. He also needs to go to jail, because it was somehow his responsibility that she took drugs while she was pregnant.
He
Like,
has a
I
penis.
just, sorry?
He has a penis.
He does. He has a penis, and he was in the vicinity, and so therefore he's responsible. And I'm just like, this is really the situation that we're in. You have the situation with the young man in California, who I think he was 13 when he was taken advantage of, and statutorily raped by an adult babysitter. And the DA, when he was pursued for child support, she's like, well, he wanted to be a big man when he did that, but now he wants to be treated like a child. It's like he was a child.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I had some questions for Dr. Reynolds. If anybody wouldn't mind, I'd love to ask a question or two. First off, thank you very much for what you've done. It's just so important. And you've really answered the what. I mean, we see what is happening now, but what we don't know is what's driving that what. What's driving people to think like that? And could it be something biological,
It's
social,
biology, Tom.
genetic? Okay, but how do you know that, Karen?
I just know.
Well, good. See, we can just don't have to answer the question. But I'd love to hear what Tania thinks.
Well, I have something to say about that if you want to
Go ahead, Dan. Yeah,
go deeper into the theory about it all. Okay, so let's go back a few million years. Let's look at the evolutionary period of humans. So humans come down from the trees, and what happens? Well, their hips narrow. Their hips narrow, and so that their legs can be directly underneath the body. And then when the hips narrow, that narrows the birth canal. And that limits the number of offspring you can have. And it means that your offspring have to come out earlier. And so you have a high infant mortality rate and a high maternal mortality rate. And survival of the group often comes down to a very simple formula. If the rate of attrition exceeds the rate of offspring, the numbers dwindle and your group is at risk of going extinct. But if the rate of offspring equals or exceeds the rate of attrition, then you maintain your numbers and your group survives. And what is the key to your offspring? Your rate of offspring is the number of females in your group. Your number of birthing females.
No.
You can double the number of males, it won't make any difference. You can cut the number of males in half, it won't make any difference. Your total number of offspring in your next generation is determined by your total number of females birthing females.
I disagree. The total number of your culture is going to definitely depend on how many females you have. But if you don't have enough males, you can't protect your culture.
That's
60% of the daggone males in South American hunter-gatherer tribes were killed in intertribal warfare. I mean, you've got to have men. And so this whole argument about how all these women,
we're not talking about cultures. We're talking about survival of the species.
That's right.
Okay,
and if the males in a group are killed off, then the females tend to migrate to the successful group.
Exactly.
And so the issue is that the larger that you can have a large female to male ratio and the species can survive. If you have a lower female to male ratio, then it becomes more problematical. Accordingly, males are the expendable species, the expendable sex.
Sure, but that's not all there is to it. That's not all there is to it.
I agree. But Tania Reynolds, please chime in.
Yeah, I think you guys are there are many layers that you can look at it, and I very much appreciate taking an evolutionary perspective. I think it's always tough because we can't say the good of the species because that evolution doesn't favor the good of the species, but
it doesn't ever.
For every man, his reproductive success is limited by access to women. So he can have more children the more women he reproduces with. So it would be in men's interest to keep women alive, as you guys identify. Like, women set the upper limit on reproduction. And then you can ask why women would have the bias. Well, self-interest, but also I think perhaps our history of patrilocality might have played a role. So across human history, it was often we had these social arrangements where upon marriage, women would leave to go live with their husbands instead of staying with their family. And so if you're surrounded by all of these women that you don't know, they're not related to you, how do you recruit support? How do you form friendships? Well, perhaps one way of doing that was advertising how much you care about the welfare of other women. So that might have favored a bias among women to care more about their fellow women in a way because they can signal. So if I have my choice of female friends and one woman is very pro-women, another woman is very pro her man, I can count on the woman who's more pro-women. So I think that's possible. I haven't done enough research to look at whether that's the case, but it's interesting is in our studies we find that women show the bias to a stronger degree than do men.
Yes.
And so I think we need to think more about, so the bias makes sense from the male perspective because of reproductive interest. You can have more children, the more women that are protected and alive. But then from the female perspective, we have to ask, well, why do women show the bias to an even stronger degree than do men? And we could say it's self-interest. We could say they're sensitized to all of these cases when they've experienced harm, and so it's salient. It's easier to identify those. But it also might make sense from an evolutionary perspective that if you needed to recruit female friends, it made sense to prefer the friends who are more on team female, show like concern for other women compared to the women who are really in favor of other men. And so I think from an evolutionary perspective, we might make those arguments, but then there are also just like more proximate explanations too. So like they've done studies looking at muscularity, and the more muscular someone is, we just see them as more agentic and not a victim, and if you actually look at like female facial morphology, it's more strongly similar, or it's more similar to that of children. So we have larger eyes, smaller nose.
Yeah.
Exactly. So like there's also just proximate cues of who is sympathy, who needs sympathy and who doesn't.
Who's vulnerable.
Or who leverages sympathy, who can leverage sympathy. And that's another thing too, right? I do think too, something that a lot of evolutionary psychologists and various men's rights people may overlook is that women didn't evolve as women. Women evolved as the mother-child dyad. Right? There's a reason why the air conditioning is sexist, right? Like that against women, and it's because women survive the cold just as well as men do, but they feel the cold more, right? Oh. They feel it more. It feels uncomfortable for them more, even though they're just as hardy, just as able to survive it. And that's because that's the early alert system to this environment is not friendly to my much more vulnerable infants, who I am always in close proximity with, right? So that's really what's going on there, is that women evolved not as women, but as the mother-child dyad. They evolved to feel, to have an early alert system, an early warning system for conditions within the environment that would maybe not endanger themselves, but endanger their much more vulnerable infants. Yeah. So you're sort of looking at this situation where women are more likely to feel discomfort in almost any situation, and they're more likely to say something about it, right? And like I was asked by someone just recently, you know, because I said when it comes to being forced into sex, right? So man forcing a woman into sex, a woman forcing a man into sex, all of the negative sequelae seem to be about the same. So, you know, sort of following from that incident, you have higher incidence of suicidality, of depression, of drug and alcohol problems, of you know, failing to do well in school. All of a sudden you're flunking out of school, or you're having a problem at work. Maybe you're having problems with developing relationships with the opposite sex, developing intimacy, all of those things, right? Problems with trust, all of those things, right? That women who have been victimized, it's like they realize that all of these things are coming from the injury of having been raped, right? But men, not so much.
Right.
Men don't necessarily say the incident that precipitated all of this was the injury, right? They don't necessarily notice that, right? And so it's like, how is this important? Well, you know, look at leprosy, right? You have a person who has leprosy and a person who does not, and they step on a piece of glass, right? Both of them step on a piece of glass, and one of them immediately notices the injury, the other does not, right? One of them immediately feels pain, the other does not. One of them notices when the injury, one of them stops, you know, puts his feet up for a few days, the other does not. One of them, you know, notices, one of them notices that the cut is getting infected, the other does not, right? And so just because the person with leprosy does not feel the pain that the person who does not have leprosy, all of that pain that's pointing to, this is a problem with your foot, right? And how you injured your foot, right? Just because they don't register that does not mean that they're not experiencing all of those negative outcomes, including, you know, sepsis and gangrene and all kinds of stuff, right? Doesn't mean they're not suffering from those negative outcomes because they couldn't actually just connect it because they didn't have that initial feeling of pain, right? That meant.
Oh, well, I wanted to thank Tania. It seems that what a lot of us have intuited and experienced and, you know, observed personally in our work and our public discussions, you've, you know, put the data behind it, and that's so incredibly helpful to all of us. So again, yes, a lot of gratitude to you for doing that work. I had a lot of questions. I will have to go pretty soon, actually, but I did one thing I wanted to ask was, you sort of identified the two major ways in which empathy, sympathy, sense of identification is increased towards women and girls. One, that feel more for women's suffering, women's pain. Two, we don't see women as agents. We don't see them as perpetrators. And I wonder whether you've done any work on seeing whether one of those trajectories is more powerful than the other. And the reason I ask this is because I started thinking recently that actually the denial of female agency may be more powerful even than the sympathy for female victims. Now, of course, this is all just intuitive, no study to back it up, but there was a recent case in Ottawa of 2 women who had acted as pimps, and they had recruited vulnerable young girls into prostitution, and they were recently given very light sentences by an Ottawa judge who said that they themselves were victims and therefore, shouldn't be punished. And it was inconceivable to me to think that 2 men who had pimped out 13 and 14-year-old girls in the way these women had, would have been given any sympathy at all, even though they themselves might well have been victims too. I mean, many people are victims who go into lives of crime. And so it seemed a case where the denial of the capacity to commit evil acts was even stronger than the sympathy for vulnerable young womanhood and the suffering that these teenage girls had experienced at the hand of the women. So I wondered if you had anything to say about that, and then I'll have to go, but thank you again.
Oh, and thank you for all of your work. I really appreciate it. And it's a fascinating question. And to be honest, our studies haven't yet looked at that, but it's a really good question of to what degree is the strength of the bias against is it just that it's so much easier to detect male agency that we especially penalize male perpetrators, or is that the strength of the sympathy is so much stronger? I'm not sure. Our studies yet can't disentangle those sufficiently, so I don't want to say yet, but that's a really good question, and we'll have to do more research on it.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
This is something that's occurred to me. This is Robert Franklin. This is something that's occurred to me numerous times over the past years. To what extent does the fact that women are our primary caregivers as children, our mothers are our primary caregivers, contribute to this? In other words, that we at the earliest stages of our lives, basically learn what it takes to please mom. And, do you think that has any bearing on the different ways that we respond to male and female needs, male and female suffering, etc.?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know of any data on that, but it would be interesting. So people who were raised by either single mothers versus single fathers, do they show the same pattern of bias? It would be interesting if you were raised by a single father, if you would actually feel more sympathy towards men compared to those who were raised by a single mother. That would be a super cool study, but I don't know of any data to attest to that. But I wouldn't be surprised if that played a role. I mean, if on average women are contributing more of the direct child care, then it would make sense at least from a child's perspective to be more closely identifying with or empathetic towards their mother, who's an advocate on average, not always, but on average on their behalf more often. So yeah, that seems plausible.
It's not necessarily learning to please mom. I think just having mom be the sort of the hand of God for small children that
There's an issue I'd like to raise with Tania. Our last general election manifesto was 80 pages long. It might have just have been the biggest manifesto in the election. And we covered 20 areas where the human rights of men and boys are assaulted by the state. And the biggest individual section was on the sexual abuse of men, and mainly by children. And we know from CDC studies, I don't know of any comparable UK studies, but certainly CDC studies would show that that there's far more female sexual offences against men than the general public understand. And I'd like to just read out, if I may, just one paragraph from that manifesto. Women as well as men suffer from the failure to hold female sex offenders to account. Michelle Elliott is the founder and editor and director of Kidscape, a British charity. Her book, Female Sexual Abuse of Children, The Ultimate Taboo, was published in 1993. In 1984, two American researchers, Petrovich and Templer, reported that of a sample of 89 incarcerated male rapists, and these are male rapists of women, 59% of them had been sexually abused as children by one or more women, sometimes their own mothers. There is therefore a de facto correlation between female sex offences and male sex offending. And a British study that was reported, it may have been in the British Psychological Society event that you presented at, Tania, found the same thing. But I've yet to see in the mainstream media any references to the link between women sexually abusing boys and those boys becoming rapists in later life.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pattern. It's a general pattern that you find that like those who are committing crimes often had experiences of abuse earlier on. So it fits with that. But I'm sure that to the extent that those data are there, they would be so distressing to people because there's a lot going on there. There's the gender dynamic where you don't want to see women as perpetrators, but then there's the mother dynamic as well, where it just feels so awful that to the extent that those data are there, then I'm sure that they would just be so unpalatable and wouldn't cohere with our expectations at all, that it'd be easier, it would be difficult to recognize. Yeah, that's really fascinating. I wasn't aware of those exact patterns. That's awful.
It may not work in academia, but out in the real world, I find great profit and explanatory power in the very simple phrase, men have always been more respected but less loved, women more loved but less respected. It fits with what you're saying, I think, to a T, and it's just the simplest kind of colloquial way of saying it. Also, I'd like to bring attention to, there's some very interesting study around heroes that I think is closely related to what you're on about. A study conducted by Kurt Gray and Daniel Wedgner. And it goes on about how the hero has the feet of clay, you know, how easy it is to reframe a hero. A hero makes one mistake and is vilified. He flips from hero to villain, whereas victim is very robust category, and it's very difficult to recast a victim into a villain. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, and I think you're totally right with both statements. The agency portion, I think, is what's driving both of those patterns that you're discussing. Like, agency is going to be linked to respect because you are the agent of the action. And, you know, we're going to admire those who are the causes of outcomes. And then we're going to give them credit as heroes. But as a villain, you are also the agent. So it would make sense that if you have that domain of agency or those attributions of agency, you could go in either category, whether it's seen as morally good or morally bad. And then, whereas if you have the qualities more associated with a patient, you know, you're just like the recipient of action, the substrate, I love that term, then you can't switch them into either of the categories as evil.
Yeah. Right. There's this thing that goes with victim, that it's an innocent victim, and we mustn't blame the victim. Mm-hmm. So once one has this victim status, then it becomes very difficult. You see, if you can't blame the victim and the victim is innocent, how do you get this person out of the victim status? You know, it's not going to be easy.
Well, and I find too that, you know, like as Tania was saying, right, that this is not necessarily great for women either.
No.
You know, it's not great to be viewed as the recipient of actions and never the agent who's performing actions. It's not necessarily a good place to be when it comes to.
It's infantilizing.
It is, of course, but you know, at the same time, you know, like if I'm right, and we actually are more willing to give women the benefit of the doubt than to protect children, you know, I would say it's like it's not even infantilizing; it's something more extreme than that.
Yeah.
Right?
So, I mean, I think that this is a lot like part of a broader pattern where we have kind of sanctified the position of victim. So it's no longer, I mean, and I think we always kind of did this. We have these biases, which are moral, they're good biases to care about the suffering of others and try to alleviate it. But because once you're cast as that victim, it's hard to see the person as a perpetrator, then there are all these moral benefits to being seen as a victim. And so over time, what you've seen is where you've like decreased our threshold for defining harm, and we're now super sensitized to what constitutes harm. So now even like a ambiguous joke might constitute harm, but as you guys note, it's still biased, you know. So even though are overly sensitized to harm in certain domains, it's very specific to the target. So we might express outrage when a woman experiences a sexist joke, but then if a man is, falsely accused or denied parental rights, like we don't experience the same outrage. So it's really interesting that these two patterns are happening simultaneously, whereas it feels as though we're becoming more and more sensitized to harm over time, but it's very specific to whose harm it is.
I think chimpanzees could teach us a lesson, right? Because, I mean, Dr. Robert Sapolsky, in his Stanford University lecture series on human behavioral biology, he was like, okay, so we know that we're not the only beings with a moral compass. We're not the only species with a moral compass. How do we know this? Well, you know, when you take some chimpanzees and you take a subordinate chimpanzee and he goes up to the dominant male and he pees in his face, right? He does something really egregious. He pees in his face. He you know, and then he just like dances around going, yeah, fuck you, right? And then he gets his ass kicked, right? Nobody in the group has any sympathy for that guy. Right? But if a subordinate chimpanzee just happens to be walking by minding his own business and the dominant male takes his day out on him, right? For no reason whatsoever, then everybody in the group is like, okay, let's give you some extra social grooming and we're going to like cuddle you and snuggle you and stuff and we're going to like treat you really nice because we recognize that you're a victim. We recognize that you didn't ask for that. Right? That you were an innocent victim and somebody decided to take his bad day out on you, right? But when it comes to, you know, that subordinate male who decides I'm going to go pee in the alpha's face and then I'm going to dance around like I just got one over on him and he gets beat up, yeah, nobody gives him any kind of extra TLC, right? And
I think, Karen, that if one of the chimps should find a cache of great food and not let anyone know, but just keep sneaking off to grab some for himself, that too will get him a beating.
Oh yeah, of course, because he's cheating. He's being a freeloader or a cheater. He's not sharing. He's not behaving right. No, it's actually not who cares. right? And this is really the thing, is I think this is the thing that human beings have lost over the last 100 years or so, is that you, maybe he didn't have to care about the other males around him because he really deeply cares about the other, the well-being of the other males around him, but he actually had to care about the well-being of the other males around him in order to maintain his good standing and the goodwill relationships that he depends on among those other males, right? Like that to maintain the cooperativeness of the males in the group. Absolutely, yes, absolutely. But what do we see now? What do we see now among humans? Is we've had rhetoric since the 1960s that men are not necessary, that they're obsolete, that they, hey, we could reduce men to 10% of the population, and we'd all be better off having done so, and all of that. So men don't necessarily need to maintain those relationships. They can essentially derive their entire positive sense of identity from female feedback, right? They're not as reliant on, because women are not as reliant on men as they were, say, 100 years ago or 200 years ago, not as reliant on men for their survival. And so men can say, well, fuck all these other men, because
I'd just like to say a couple of things. I mean, I think men to this day, I mean, it's you get a very distorted view if you spend a lot of time, as I do and Karen does and others here, in the men's rights bubble, I guess. The reality is that men do not get much self-esteem out of being men. Erin Pitsey puts it very well. She basically says that the females are born valuable because of their future potential, and men, at least the vast majority of men, are born utterly worthless. They have to acquire worth, and they generally do that through work. Some try and do it through crime. No, I just see. I mean, there is a huge in-group preference among women, and there is none at all among men. So it's why things like the glass ceiling narrative. It's like so many things that feminists talk about. It's pure projection. Sorry. I suspect I may have gone on a bit of a tangent there, Troy. Sorry about that.
Yeah, so I think you're totally right that you don't see the same pattern of in-group bias among men, and we find that in our studies as well. For the most part, we see that women show the in-group bias to the same degree, and you're right. Redmond did a lot of the initial work demonstrating this, at least on an implicit level, and so. I think that this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. If we think about men's roles throughout history, they were often warriors on the battlefield. And so when you are selecting fellow men that you would like to be, there by your side on the battlefield, you want the guy who's going to be courageous and tough and has a high tolerance for pain. He's going to be dominant, going to be aggressive. If your comrade is very sensitive to pain or emotional suffering or not very courageous, you're probably going to derogate him because those aren't useful traits for the battlefield. So throughout evolutionary history, men were more often in these coalitions. Then what you would predict is that when men select other men as partners and friends, they're attending to traits that were historically beneficial on the battlefield. And so they're not going to respond with the same feelings of sympathy because responding in that way wouldn't be useful in times of warfare. And so now in today's society, we are very peaceful. Thankfully, currently we're very peaceful. And so a lot of those jobs that men filled aren't there to the same degree. I mean, there's still many of men in the armed forces, but one of the huge benefits of men throughout history was protecting the group or providing for the group through these like physically demanding jobs, and we are slowly eliminating those. And so it's going to be challenging for men to have the sense of purpose if some of their adaptations have been designed such that they get purpose from these jobs, from contributing in these ways. But also it's going to be more challenging as a society to recognize the contributions that men are making. So it's really easy when you're dependent on a group of male warriors to defend your group to identify, wow, men are contributing a lot. Or if you can't pull that like plow yourself, you know, you're going to be grateful for men. But then as these jobs become safer and more women fill them, it's going to be hard to detect the ways, it's just not going to be as salient, the ways in which men are contributing.
I'd like to bring up something which I don't think we've touched on so far, which is the issue of stoicism. For all the feminist talk that men would commit suicide in far lower numbers if they talked about their feelings more, I suspect that for every such man, there's 10 men who are still alive through stoicism, you know, the ability to sort of draw a line under pain and move on with your life. But stoicism, to me, is one of the I think it's a wonderful quality. It's a wonderful quality at the individual men's level. For men as a class, it's an utter disaster because you know it means, I mean, you know, anybody in this country, I'm sure it's the same in the States. Anybody who runs a sort of fathers group, you know, of men who can't see their kids and so on, they will typically find that men will come for one or two sessions and they'll never be seen again. Some of them commit suicide, but most sort of draw a line under their pain, and it's an appalling pain, and somehow move on with their lives. But it ties in, I think, with men's problem at collaborating. I mean, you know, we're the only men's rights party in the world, in the English-speaking world. But you look at the amount of men suffering. You know, you've got to say, why are there not 10 political parties for men in every developed country, you know, in the world? Whereas, you know, women's organizations, my God, the countless thousands of them. It's you know, I mean, there's no easy answer to this, because I think if men became less stoic, they might collaborate better, but then they'd be less happy.
Yeah, that's actually really, it's a good point. In terms of, you know, like there's this idea that in order for men to be able to survive the new age, they need to change within themselves. I mean, like there was somebody on Twitter. I am no longer on Twitter, but I am sort of, I guess, spying on somebody's conversation on Twitter right now. And you know, she's like, well, it's the patriarchy that's doing all of this stuff to men. Yeah. And but she acknowledges that there might be biological or hormonal reasons why, you know, men might be less likely to reach out for help or whatever. And I'm thinking to myself, so what are you saying? Like, should we just like hormonally treat men, make them more like women, and then they'll be able to receive the proper treatment? You know, like there's you have to realize that up until about 100 years ago, there were, I think even up until probably the 1990s. I mean, like I remember watching the Flintstones, you know, and their Loyal Order of Water Buffaloes. I remember watching Everybody Loves Raymond, where Raymond and his brother Robert go to the Elks Lodge and see the men sitting around naked in the sauna, the old men. And, you know, and it's like, there was this mystique in the episode of the Flintstones, right? There was this mystique, like, what are those men getting up to? They must be getting up to something really crazy, right? Wilma and Betty were just like obsessed with what these men were doing at the Loyal Order of Water Buffalo Lodge, right? Yeah, well, it's not a deeply seated moral taboo. It's a recent moral situation. It's not deeply seated. It's not. There's no precursor in history. I mean, like, I guess women always sort of objected to it on some level because men were getting together outside of women's, sort of field of supervision and maybe getting up to trouble, right? But men were always allowed to do that, right?
Yeah, well, it's the growth of female power.
But now when men actually arguably need the company of other men most, right? They need the company, the brotherhood of other men most, because they've essentially been deprived of it. And like this is not some kind of freaking crazy men's rights claptrap, right? This is shit that Michael Kimmel was saying in the Mask You Live In and all of this crap, right? That men need each other more than ever right now, right? And that is when it's illegal to have a male-only space. It is against the freaking law to have a male-only space, to have a male-only club, to have men get together with each other in a male-only space with no women present, right? And just, I guess, I don't know, whatever, talk or hug it out or whatever they need to do, right? That's not allowed. When you allow that, then men use that, and this is the argument from feminism, that when men are allowed to have male-only spaces, they use those spaces to engage in networking for the purposes of career, and they squeeze women out, right? And women find themselves on the margins, and they and I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, my younger son, he has his male friends, he has his male teachers who he has bonded with in his own inimitable fashion by sending his teacher innumerable emails of ridiculous memes, and to the point where his teacher comes to him in another class and says, "Please stop sending me emails." But he does this. He cultivates these relationships with the men and young men around him, and somehow he manages. But most boys don't. Most boys are stuck dealing with their mothers. Their fathers are barely present or absent altogether, right? Because they're either working or they're not welcome in the house, right? And they're not allowed to be friends with boys and exclude women. They're not allowed to have the Calvin and Hobbes, girls are get rid of nasty girls or whatever it was, clubhouse. They're not allowed to have that. They're not allowed to just be boys together. They're not allowed to be men together. They have to be supervised by women. And I'm just looking at it like this is not okay.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that we do have these. It's interesting when we have expectations of parity and then assumptions that there are differences. And in the case of social support, we assume that men want to bond with one another in the way that women do. So even our concepts of talk therapy might be more female focused, and perhaps that's not as advantageous for men. Perhaps men bond with one another through physical exercise or goal-directed tasks more. And when it's interesting that we'll discuss, for example, deaths of despair. The crisis with opioid addiction or suicide. And at one point we have this concern over the suffering of individuals in society, but then at the same time, I don't think we're giving men the space. We're not allowing them to bond with one another in the way that they do. We assume if they bond, it must be the way that women do. and it should be with women. And I understand the motives for that. I understand that people are concerned that women are going to be, left out, and they were left out of a lot of important social conversations throughout history. But if we are concerned about men's well-being, then perhaps it's positive for them to have, these male-male friendship networks, and we shouldn't be policing them to the same degree that we are.
I wonder if I might ask a question to put a question to Tania. It's sort of outside of what we've been talking about, but I'd be fascinated to learn what response your recent research has got from feminist colleagues.
Yeah, so I think it's tough because at first there's a little bit of pushback because they're thinking about all the ways in which it's very salient in their mind, all the ways in which women are disadvantaged, which they are there at the top of society. But I don't think people are aware of how bad men's statistics are. And so what I try to tell them is, on one side of the distribution, yes, women are less likely to be CEOs, full professors. Yes, yes, yes. But at the bottom of the distribution, men are much more likely to be homeless, die of drug addiction, drop out of school, be incarcerated, commit suicide. And when I bring up these things, I think that lens is helpful to acknowledge where they're coming from, and then talk about the places where you see that men have worse outcomes. Because I don't know how much. Now I can't speak for everyone, but I think it's hard for people to be aware of the true disparities when our media is so focused on the places where women are disadvantaged. And I think it makes sense from our cognitive perspective. If it's just easier to detect women suffering, then we're gonna and we care because women are placed in that victim role. We're gonna pay attention to all of those times. But it's just, you never hear about all of these domains where men have these horrible outcomes. And so I try to present the case, and I think that framework goes a long way to meet them where they're at, and then say, well, what about all these other things? Because I think they're two sides of the story.
Okay. Well, can I just say I've been absolutely obsessed, and I'm happy to admit that, by gender issues for over 10 years now. I'm not aware of a single area, certainly in the UK, and I'd be astonished if it were any different in North America. I'm not aware of a single area where women are disadvantaged. There are areas where they, let's say, are less. Fewer women than men. For example, are CEOs. Okay, that's not disadvantage. That is. I mean, that's the idea that that's disadvantage is to me a feminist narrative. And there is not. I do not know of a single feminist narrative there's not one or more of five things: a baseless conspiracy theory, a fantasy, a lie, a delusion, or a myth. And in the case of CEOs, for example, that great feminist narrative, it's been known for the number one thing that drives the gender balance in the boardroom is work ethic. And there's a sociologist called Dr. Catherine Hacking who 20 years ago published a thing called preference theory, and she found in the UK that 4 in 7 British men are work-centered, and only 1 in 7 British women. So boardroom balance is more to do with that, and it's also been known for a good many years that there's a causal link between increasing the proportion of women on corporate boards and corporate financial decline. And I've presented that to the House of Commons in 2012. The evidence for that, and it's kind of off topic, but all I'm trying to say here, Tania, is I do not buy a single feminist narrative that women are disadvantaged. That they are the women in the West are some of the most privileged human beings ever to walk this earth.
Yeah, I
sorry, go ahead.
It's important to think about average differences in traits, and I would agree with you insofar as we don't look at, well, there are a lot of traits that we do find average differences between men and women that are going to be related to these disparities in outcomes. So, for example, job preferences or interest in working with people versus things. These are
Right.
going to play a role. And I agree that we don't sufficiently discuss the disparities in those traits that are going to be relevant when we talk about these outcomes. But they went both ways. So, like, if we talk about, for example, like men's likelihood of like their earlier mortality, some percentage of that might be related to their risk taking, and we do find discrepancies between men and women in risk taking. And so I think it is important when we talk about these outcomes, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's bias. I guess for me, the claims that I think I would most identify or feel as though have like the most validity behind them would be women's like control over reproduction. So access to abortion, I think, is important. And, you know, protection from harm, and then like maternal leave, I think, is important. You know, and we can talk about how there are also disparities in men's gaining access to like paternity. But I think that those are some domains where throughout history women weren't given the same freedoms. A lot of this it's tough because it's related to biology. It just is the case that pregnancy occurs in the female body, and so that's going to always produce like I don't know if there's going to be a fair outcome when it comes to these reproductive issues, because there's a disparity in biology that we have to grapple with. So I think I would focus on those, but I do hear what you're saying about like just because we notice disparities at the top does not mean that there's discrimination. We need to think about base rates of traits, but so too do we for disparities at the bottom. You know, so if we see a greater likelihood of male suicide, well, some percentage of that is going to be due perhaps to men's willingness to use violence even on themselves. Now, that's not to say that they're not suffering, and that's very, very important. But if you see a disparity in, you know, suicide, it might be related to these disparities in traits.
Yeah, well, it's essentially invariable. It's not just family courts, which people are pretty well versed in the extreme disparity between paternal custody and maternal custody. And it's important to understand that the preference for maternal custody, that particular bias, and it is a bias on a part of judges that's been studied at least half a dozen times, is so pronounced. But the important thing is in addition to that the pro-maternal bias ends up being visited on children who, it's very clear, benefit from having both parents actively involved in their lives. Family courts do the opposite quite regularly, almost invariably. And so it obviously redounds to the detriment of fathers, but more so to the detriment of children, which seems uniquely awful to me. But it extends far beyond family courts. For example, in adoption courts in 34 states, I believe, we have laws that say that single fathers may not know about the adoption of their child unless they have registered with the paternity registry, the putative father registry in the state, that few people even know exist, and that the states make no effort to publicize either the fact of those registries or their effect on fathers' rights. And it goes on and on and on to the fact that, for example, we spend $5 billion a year enforcing child support obligations, which, of course, are predominantly, the subjects are predominantly men. And yet we spend only $10 million a year enforcing visitation rights almost all of whom were fathers. That's a 500 to 1 ratio. So, in terms of the courts, we every day in every way, what we do is anti-father, pro-mother, and anti-child. It's not a good situation.
That's one of the things that I was, sort of addressing earlier is like, are we so slavish to the I guess the female imperative that we're willing to actually prioritize women's well-being, their feelings, their sense of I guess happiness or whatever, even above that of children. And I think that really we have to some degree done that. But as far as the CEOs thing, I mean, and I think that this is kind of telling, right? I sat down for a 90-minute interview with a woman named Sachi Cole from BuzzFeed a year or two ago. And she said, I was telling her about how, right now in the UK, the demographic entering kindergarten right now who is the least likely to graduate high school or enter college is white working class boys. And that this is kind of something that is the case across the entire English speaking world, is that boys are falling behind in education at the earliest stages. So you're talking kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, right? They are falling behind. It used to be that boys were ahead of girls in math and science, and girls were ahead of boys in reading and writing and social studies. And now girls are ahead of boys in everything, right? And she said, well, but CEOs are almost all men. And I tried to explain to her that, even if you were to view women and men as exactly the same, right? There's something called lag, right? And the CEOs of today were elementary school students 50 or 60 years ago, right? And so why are we punishing? Why are you justifying? It sounds like you're justifying abandoning 6 and 7-year-old boys, right? Just cut them loose, right? Because their grandfathers are doing better in the boardroom than their grandmothers, right? And I made that case, and then her producer actually asked her, do you want to change your answer? And she said, no, I think my point about CEOs was perfectly adequate. And I was blown away. I'm like, literally, you're saying that it's okay to abandon young boys because of how things were and how things advantaged their grandfathers 50 or 60 years ago. About CEOs was perfectly adequate. And I was blown away. I'm like, literally, you're saying that it's okay to abandon young boys because of how things were and how things advantaged their grandfathers 50 or 60 years ago. A war crime, apparently, according to the Geneva Convention, collective punishment is a war crime. But not when it comes to the original sin of being born male, I guess. So.
Yeah. So I think that some of it does seem to carry like a religious component, where I think this sensitivity to harm, and I guess for me, I see it as more of like the victim role is what's sanctified, like, and so But you're right that there's a gendered component to it, because we feel such strong outrage when we identify cases where women have a disadvantage relative to men, and we have to be careful. I take Mike's point that we need to be careful of perhaps an asymmetry such that women are not doing as well on average. We do see that through a moral lens. It feels religious. It feels taboo to question it. And it's this, and I think a lot of this is stemming from this, like this focus on egalitarianism, where we want outcomes to be the same, or at least not the explicit belief. So we measured some egalitarianism. We measured egalitarianism in some of our studies and found that those who more strongly endorsed statements like, the world would be better off if we were all treated more equally, they showed the bias to the strongest degree. It wasn't the people who were lower in this. So I think when people are taking these approaches, they're thinking of how can we get women up here with men, but their lens is only focused on the context where women have a lower outcomes or worse outcomes, and they're just looking past all of the contexts where where women's outcomes are better than men's, and those are okay. And I teach like gender studies classes, and I think it's so interesting when I present these studies. Like men die 5 years sooner on average. No response. It's just like, okay, people take notes, but I can't help but wonder if the pattern went the other way, what would we say about that? Every time I ask, like when I report these stats, like men are much more likely to die at the job, and no one's phased. And I think, like, what if the data went the other way? What if the most of work deaths were women? What would we have to say about that? And so, yeah, there does seem to be a religious component to it, and I'm hoping that those can be combated with data, just making people aware. I'm assuming a lot of it is that people aren't aware of these patterns, but I do think that these cognitive biases are going to play a role where it is, once even made aware of these patterns, it's going to be harder to evoke the same sympathy for men.
I wonder if I might ask a question to put a question to Tania. It's sort of outside of what we've been talking about, but I'd be fascinated to learn what response your recent research has got from feminist colleagues.
Yeah, so I think it's tough because at first there's a little bit of pushback because they're thinking about all the ways in which it's very salient in their mind, all the ways in which women are disadvantaged, which they are there at the top of society. But I don't think people are aware of how bad men's statistics are. And so what I try to tell them is, on one side of the distribution, yes, women are less likely to be CEOs, full professors. Yes, yes, yes. But at the bottom of the distribution, men are much more likely to be homeless, die of drug addiction, drop out of school, be incarcerated, commit suicide, and when I bring up these things, I think that lens is helpful to acknowledge where they're coming from, and then talk about the places where you see that men have worse outcomes. Because I don't know how much, now I can't speak for everyone, but I think it's hard for people to be aware of the true disparities when our media is so focused on the places where women are disadvantaged. And I think it makes sense from our cognitive perspective. If it's just easier to detect women suffering, then we're gonna and we care because women are placed in that victim role. We're gonna pay attention to all of those times. But it's just, you never hear about all of these domains where men have these horrible outcomes. And so I try to present the case, and I think that framework goes a long way to meet them where they're at, and then say, well, what about all these other things? Because I think they're two sides of the story.
Okay. Well, can I just say I've been absolutely obsessed, and I'm happy to admit that, by gender issues for over 10 years now. I'm not aware of a single area, certainly in the UK, and I'd be astonished if it were any different in North America. I'm not aware of a single area where women are disadvantaged. There are areas where they, let's say, are less. I mean, far, fewer women than men. For example, our CEOs. Okay, that's not disadvantage. That is. I mean, that's the idea that that's disadvantage is to me a feminist narrative. And there is not. I do not know a single feminist narrative that's not one or more of five things: a baseless conspiracy theory, a fantasy, a lie, a delusion, or a myth. And in the case of CEOs, for example, that great feminist narrative, it's been known for the number one thing that drives the gender balance in the boardroom is work ethic. And there's a sociologist called Dr. Catherine Hacking who 20 years ago published a thing called preference theory, and she found in the UK that 4 in 7 British men are work-centered, and only 1 in 7 British women. So boardroom balance is more to do with that, and it's also been known for a good many years that there's a causal link between increasing the proportion of women on corporate boards and corporate financial decline. And I've presented that to the House of Commons in 2012. The evidence for that, and it's kind of off topic, but all I'm trying to say here, Tanya, is I do not buy a single feminist narrative that women are disadvantaged. That they are. The women in the West are some of the most privileged human beings ever to walk this earth.
Yeah, I
sorry,
think
go ahead.
it's important to think about average differences in traits, and I would agree with you insofar as we don't look at, well, there are a lot of traits that we do find average differences between men and women that are going to be related to these disparities in outcomes. So, for example, job preferences or interest in working with people versus things, these are
Right.
going to play a role. And I agree that we don't sufficiently discuss the disparities in those traits that are going to be relevant when we talk about these outcomes. But they work both ways. So, if we talk about, for example, men's likelihood of their earlier mortality, some percentage of that might be related to their risk taking, and we do find discrepancies between men and women in risk taking. And so I think it is important when we talk about these outcomes, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's bias. I guess for me, the claims that I think I would most identify or feel as though have the most validity behind them would be women's control over reproduction. So access to abortion, I think, is important. And protection from harm, and then maternal leave, I think, is important. And we can talk about how there are also disparities in men's gaining access to paternity. But I think that those are some domains where throughout history women weren't given the same freedoms. A lot of this it's tough because it's related to biology. It just is the case that pregnancy occurs in the female body, and so that's going to always produce disparity. I don't know if there's going to be a fair outcome when it comes to these reproductive issues because there's a disparity in biology that we have to grapple with. So I think I would focus on those, but I do hear what you're saying about just because we notice disparities at the top does not mean that there's discrimination. We need to think about base rates of traits, but so too do we for disparities at the bottom. So if we see a greater likelihood of male suicide, well, some percentage of that is going to be due perhaps to men's willingness to use violence even on themselves. Now, that's not to say that they're not suffering, and that's very, very important. But if you see a disparity in suicide, it might be related to these disparities in traits.
Right, but
Yeah, well, it's essentially invariable. It's not just family courts, which people are pretty well versed in the extreme disparity between paternal custody and maternal custody. And it's important to understand that the preference for maternal custody, that particular bias, and it is a bias on the part of judges that's been studied at least half a dozen times, is so pronounced. But the important thing is in addition to that, the pro-maternal bias ends up being visited on children who, it's very clear, benefit from having both parents actively involved in their lives. Family courts do the opposite quite regularly, almost invariably. And so it obviously redounds to the detriment of fathers, but more so to the detriment of children, which seems uniquely awful to me. But it's, it extends far beyond family courts. For example, in adoption courts in 34 states, I believe, we have laws that say that single fathers may not know about the adoption of their child unless they have registered with the paternity registry, the putative father registry in the state, that few people even know exist, and that the states make no effort to publicize either the fact of those registries or their effect on fathers' rights. And it goes on and on and on to the fact that, for example, we spend $5 billion a year enforcing child support obligations, which, of course, are predominantly the subjects are predominantly men, and yet we spend only $10 million a year enforcing visitation rights, almost all of whom are fathers. That's a 500 to 1 ratio. So, in terms of the courts, we every day in every way, what we do is anti-father, pro-mother, and anti-child. It's not a good situation.
Yeah, I think that so scholars who are very careful and study sex differences in a very nuanced lens came out in defense of a lot of the statements that James Damore made. There are different distributions of traits and abilities and preferences among men and women that do correspond to what you would predict based on the job or aspects of a STEM career. And so a lot of the things that he was saying were backed up by empirical data. And I think there's a study that you guys would really like if you don't know of it already. It's by Block and Croft and colleagues. It's 2019. And they found that when you talk about women's underrepresentation in occupations, people are more likely to attribute it to social barriers, whereas men's underrepresentation in certain occupations, they attribute it to internal forces. So men,
personal preference, agency, yeah.
Yes, sorry, just a few seconds, Troy. Thank you. Tania, I'd just like to offer you a book that was published about 6 or 7 months ago. It's an absolutely astonishing work. William Collins's The Empathy Gap: Male Disadvantages and the Mechanisms of Their Neglect. And I'll happily put a copy in the post to you, and it should be on the reading list of every gender studies course in the world.
Thank you. I look forward to reading that. It sounds like totally relevant. I'd love to. And I think there's a lot of great work out there that you all are doing and advocating for these disparities. So I appreciate that. And I'm hoping that by having more of these conversations, we can draw attention to the gaps in our empathy, the blind spots in our moral concern, and, realize that we're lacking in compassion for a lot of men who mean very well and who have been victimized or disadvantaged. And so I'm really grateful to you, Troy, for organizing this. I think it's very productive.
Bye.